So Dr. Jenneth Parker has a background in philosophy of science, philosophy of social science and ethics, which has informed her approach to sustainability. She also has a continuing interest in participatory forms of adult and community learning about the ethics and politics of environment and development. Since 1992, she's worked on sustainability, politics and ethics in teaching and learning, including at the University of Sussex, where she got a PhD, and on the acclaimed International MSc on Education for Sustainability program devised by Oxfam and WWF UK. She's worked with UNESCO on the links between education for all and education for sustainable development. Since then, she's worked as an interdisciplinary expert on research programs, including the major Quest NERC-funded climate science program, set up to incorporate biotic and marine feedbacks into Earth system science. And Jenneth moved to the Schumacher Institute as the lead researcher on an EU-funded project, Converge, focused on global justice and the prospects for human development in the context of planetary limits. And she stayed on there to pursue further the implications of interdisciplinary systems thinking, and indeed she's a research director there. She's published on sustainability learning, climate and philosophical issues of the politics of knowledge, including indigenous and local knowledge. And we look forward to hearing more, Jess. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us here.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's a lovely opportunity. So what I'm going to try and do today is to talk a bit about the way in which a systems approach helps to inform our understanding of issues of justice and the global environment. So I will be kind of going between some philosophical and methodological questions and also actual, real sort of nitty-gritty questions. And so I'll be trying to combine a bit of stuff about the approach that we take at the Institute and some general issues, which I'm sure are probably well known to you already, but hopefully we can explain how a systems approach from our point of view helps us understand these and get a bit of more leverage on the system. And I will also talk about some examples of stuff that we do at the Institute and try and give you a feel for the kind of way that we try to do things. Okay, so just with regard to the initial slide, this is a picture of some women and children at an event held by an international partner that we've worked with, we do continue to work with, in Tamil Nadu, called Social Change and Development. And they are a fantastic sustainability organisation. In many ways, we have so much to learn from them. They are genuinely at the forefront, I would say, in terms of trying to pull together and revitalise traditional knowledge of how to live sustainably in the environment, of often a very challenging environment in Tamil Nadu. It's southern India, very hot monsoons, etc. Together with new knowledge. So they try to combine the two, and I think that's a very interesting thing to think about when we're thinking about making progress in terms of the global environment. Okay, so there we go. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about what do we mean by the global environment and talk about a little bit about the systems approach to that. And one of the systems ideas is nested scales, and what does that mean in terms of the global environment, and how that informs ideas about local to global and what that means, and the idea of interdependence and how that affects the way we might think about things, or maybe how that as a new view of looking at things might change our thinking. And then thinking about justice and what that means in the context of issues of the global environment. Particularly, perhaps, and a good example is thinking about historic injustice and the so-called carbon debt of rich nations, which is still a massive stumbling block when it comes to international agreements. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how global convergence as a concept, this is a project that we were involved in, because although it's very easy to get quite technocratic about the global environment and earth system science and climate modelers and so on. It can all get a bit technocratic. But my view is also we try to work in an interdisciplinary way, and that means that we really need mobilizing visions, that can sort of unite us. And I guess I might get a little bit into some philosophical questions there about whether we can develop mobilizing visions that unite us and still respect and value the enormous diversity that we have in human societies, and indeed our biomes, the biomes that make up the global environment. And then I'll talk a bit about the industrial economy and the idea of a living economy, land use, and issues of justice and global justice around land use. So it's going to be a pretty big kind of overview. And probably mixing up levels of sort of examples and methodology as we go along, but there'll be, hopefully I shall try to only speak for 45 minutes and we'll have quite a nice bit of time for questions. Okay, so what do we mean by the global environment? Well, so this is a kind of systems diagram, So yeah, this is a systems picture of quite a sort of technocratic Earth systems science type picture of interactions. It's focused on cities, but basically it's a way to show the kind of holistic and interactive approach that the system sciences take. And so when I think of the global environment as somebody who's trying to be more of a systems thinker, I think of all these different interacting systems interacting in a process through time. So in terms of the kind of approach to knowledge that has been very dominant in the West, which has been quite sort of linear, perhaps, and causal linear processes have been a very strong feature of the kind of analysis that we're used to, I suppose, still used to. But if you think about the way law attributes cause, it's extremely limited, and you have to prove sort of linear causal relationships between cause and effect if liability is to be shown, which is one reason, incidentally, why most of the really, really important things that happen in the world, you can't hold anyone liable to them under current structures of law, because they are combinations of things. And one of the things I like about this diagram is that it's a very sort of dynamic and pictorial way of showing some of those combinations. That is also consistent with our science. So the Earth system, I mean, this is like showing you one little bit, but if we were to think about the Earth system as a whole, and I'm thinking here something like that you know about it, something like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, for example. When we had the Millennium Development Goals, one of the interesting things that was a goal was to reduce impacts on the global environment, but people realised that this couldn't be measured properly. And so having the goal actually put in place a whole programme of analysis and measurement called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And that's a fascinating document because it talks about the way in which the whole global ecosystem is comprised of all these different characteristic biomes, and so the way in which they interact. And so you get this very clear idea of a whole that consists of a sum of functioning parts. And when you start thinking about the degradation of those parts, you realise that this is something that can never just be a local matter. So it's, if you like, if you're thinking about responsibilities and duties, then you could say, well, actually, it's really not up to you to think, oh, well, I own this bit of the planet, therefore I can trash it with impunity, because you're always going to be affecting something and somebody else. So that's a real important matter when we're thinking about justice. And later on, you know, I'm going to have a little go at, well, does this idea of interdependence change or enhance perhaps what we mean by justice, and links it, I think in my mind, it links it quite firmly to concepts of duties and responsibilities, which we can talk about a bit more later. So yeah, this very dynamic idea of what is the global environment. It's not something out there, it's something that we all inhabit, we are all part of, and we all contribute to. And I guess one of the things about being involved in an Earth System Science project is that I got it was a very steep learning curve for me, because I was there as a kind of interdisciplinary facilitator rather than a specialist in Earth System Science. But what I began to understand, and I'm still learning about, is the way in which Earth System Science is developing as a relatively new science, which has only been enabled, or partly enabled, by the massive growth in computing power that we now have, but also, the way in which, as a sort of global science, it's also limited by the kind of data that we've got, and the way in which it's generating new demands for different kinds of data. And just to give you an idea, and to carry on the theme about the interactive nature of the global environment, this QUEST program was the first big climate program to actually add in biotic feedbacks. And you might think, well, it's pretty basic, isn't it? Surely, all the trees and plants on the earth that are busy photosynthesizing, and all the plankton in the sea, which, as James Lovelock tells us, are partly responsible for our atmosphere, us having an atmosphere to breathe. All those things had been left out of climate models, and they still work to a pretty high extent. And so adding in all these really, really important feedbacks from the living world has actually kind of destabilized models for a bit until you get it right. So there's all sorts of really interesting things about the way in which an interactive, complex science, such as Earth System Science, from which we're getting so much information about how the world works, it's in process, and it's not a certain science. It could not possibly be a certain science in the way in which, say, mechanics and even some aspects of deep physics can be a lot more certain in some respects, because you're dealing with life systems, living systems, and they develop and then process through time. So the model of the global environment that we're looking at is complex if you're from a systems perspective. Okay, so if we think about scales and scales of activity and scales of agency, in fact, this is thinking about economy in that kind of way. And it's also, this was an extract from the diagram and the piece of text next to it. It's an extract from a paper that I did about learning cities for a UNESCO conference. And I was talking about the current financial system and the way in which the world hangs together in that respect. And from a systems perspective, from a sort of, let's say, political ecology perspective, the living economy, the planetary living economy, is the basis for all wealth and all human activity. And the social economy, in which I include care and the support of humans and so on for each other, and welfare systems and so on, is the basis as well for the money economy. And financialization, which we can talk about, is a kind of outgrowth, if you like, on all of that. And I guess one of the systems approaches here is that people tend to think that, or economists often talk, as though you could trade off ecosystems against other financialized benefits. But if they're the very basis of your economy, they're the basis of the whole living economy, then it's actually a nonsense to talk about trade-offs. The question of fungibility of money and the fungibility of carbon, the basis for people setting up a carbon market system, because basically one pound or whatever of carbon is the same everywhere in the global atmosphere, and money is fungible, i.e. tradable in its current form. But what I was arguing here is that ecosystems aren't tradable. Would you rather lose your heart or your lungs? Because the whole thing hangs together as a whole. So with regard to if we think about this nested diagram in a different way, if you think about it as sort of local in the middle, going out to global on the outside, and sort of scales, you can use, a nested scales kind of model in this way as well. Then you can sort of think, well, when it comes to justice, we have issues of justice at the local level. We have issues of justice at the national level. We have issues of justice at our regional level. And we have issues of justice at our global level, and practically everything in between. So it gets quite complex. And one of the things that I guess about systems approaches is that they are designed to cope with complexity. So that instead of sort of going, oh well, look, this is all far too complicated, we know the world is complex, but actually for the sake of getting an answer, we're going to go in a straight line. We can intelligently respond to complexity with a whole load of tools that can be a bit more adequate to the task. So that's one reason I'm sort of sticking with the systems approach and trying to work with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Converge, and these slides are just slightly dated insofar as it says the project will do this and will do that, but actually it's finished and it's already happened. So apologies for that, I didn't change the tense. But I think even though this is a project that was completed about 4 or 5 years ago now, it's still very relevant. So it's started out with a strong and interesting conception of global ecological justice that was proposed as part of the Kyoto process, which was a while ago now. And somebody called Aubrey Mayer proposed a conception of contraction and convergence, which basically had quite a strong influence, even though it wasn't completely taken up, had quite a strong influence in the process, because it was based on, let's say, an intuitive notion of fairness and conception of the global commons, which of course is not liked by classical economists, with the idea that everyone has to own everything, but the idea that the Earth's atmosphere could be held in common by humanity is an intuitively acceptable one to a lot of people. And if you're going to reach international agreements, then it's terribly important to find a sort of ethical framing that everybody can accept. And that's one of the great difficulties, I think, that we do have internationally. Okay, so the idea was that if it is the case that every citizen has an equal right to use the global atmosphere, then rich countries who've industrialized and already used up their budget some time ago should be contracting their use, and whilst still understanding that developing countries where people are suffering the effects of climate change and have it. So on this basis of just 2 principles, the idea that the Earth's atmosphere was held in common and that each person on the planet had an equal right to use it, a kind of approach was developed that allowed for common but differentiated responsibilities, and that's a phrase that you can hear in climate negotiations. And that sort of idea does still inform the approach, but it's still wrangled over very, so to what extent the rich countries do owe a debt, etc. And I'm just going to I probably won't linger on all these slides too long, but just to give you an idea of, if we think about global justice and the global environment, current forms of globalization, what they involve, the kinds of resource flows that they involve. So if we think about the planetary resources as a whole, not just the atmosphere, but all kinds of things that we need for human development and also to keep our ecological systems healthy. You begin to get into the territory of that the Club of Rome was talking about, of looking at resources as a whole that human beings need and where they're going and what's the justice with regard to that. And in this respect, we might think about, for example, a sort of Western industrialized countries having had their dash for Africa, having carried out their imperial projects of, let's say, using up land and resources in particular ways at that particular point in history. And now we have another dash for Africa going on, which is about mineral and mining resources, which is, in which the Chinese are very big actors. Of course, they're not the only actors. But where are the planet's resources going and who is benefiting? These are linked questions when we're looking at the global environment. So I guess people think of the global environment as primarily the living systems, and I have to say I do tend to do that myself, but I think planetary resources are arguably part of the global environment also. That maybe we should consider, that these resources are perhaps also a matter of justice. Okay. So I was just thinking about the sort of political processes of how we develop framings that can be of any use to anyone in the sphere of global politics and global Earth system governance. I don't know if you've come across this, but there's a very interesting and very rapidly developing centre and programme for Earth system governance, and it's deeply involved in questions around justice and what a just Earth system governance might look like. So how do we know when we come up with a concept and a framework that is of use to people, and how might we test it? Suppose you're doing a research project, as we were. Well, we concluded that it's a messy business, but there are different communities out there who are our kind of research beneficiary communities. So some local communities, policy communities, and sustainability practitioners. We also wanted to see whether different disciplines could link to the convergence concept, and whether that would be useful for people from a different perspectives. One of the things about doing a sort of interdisciplinary check on stuff that you're doing is that sometimes it points out something really, really vital that you've missed. So the interdisciplinary side of things is like an extra dimension of complexity, just in case there wasn't enough. I suppose frames of understanding. I think this is quite interesting to just think about briefly, because quite often as academics or people who spent time thinking and researching into things, if you're part of an expert committee or you're carrying out hopefully useful research, what are you actually, how do you measure the impact of what you're doing, and how do you measure what might be successful? And if you're, when you're thinking about can you provide some sort of simple and ethically acceptable bases for international agreements, I think that's quite a hard thing to try and do. It's a lot of trial and error involved, of course, in all these things. The point about the view of human being is a pretty important one. If you think about, for example, the Earth System Governance Project, what model of human being are they implicitly using? Is it actually, as is often the case, by default, a very Western model? Is it a model of, very limited economic human model, economic man, so-called? Is it a model that includes the fact that the vast majority of human beings on the earth seem to frame their meaning in life and understanding in terms of religion and faith? Do the ways in which we're trying to engage with people actually have a chance of connecting? I think those are really seriously important questions. So just to talk about one of the sort of techniques in, just very briefly, systems modelling is a really interesting way of putting together, mapping interactions between different elements. And this is essentially what is happening in things like earth system sciences. But you can develop systems modelling for much more conceptual hypotheses about the ways in which different kinds of social and biophysical elements interact. Yeah, I can share with you. Actually, there's a systems map in the thing that you've been sent, the restorative land use paper, which is all about land use, replanting, farming and harvesting, the relationships between waste and nutrients and so on. So you can get a sort of idea about how a system works. And we use this about food, so we look at the food system. But systems mapping is a key sort of tool for getting a systems handle on many things. And it gives you, one of the reasons I like it is a sort of, somebody who's always on the borderline of academia, research and activism, is that when you map the system, you can often see relationships between areas that you haven't quite twigged before. And you can see the potential for new alliances between groups of people who might have their main mode of livelihood or their area of interest in one part of the system. If you can sort of get a conceptual map of how you think it's connected to another part, then you can see how different actors who are working in different parts of the system might have a common interest. I think that's actually really powerful. Yeah, one of the things about systems, obviously, is when you start thinking about it, you can draw systems at any scale. Now, if let's just be, kind of make some really obvious physical points here. If you are simply thinking about America and making America great without reference to the rest of the world, you will be missing out on a whole load of interactions and impacts that what you're doing has on other people. And where you draw the boundaries of your system is a highly political act. One of the interesting quotes that we've just been doing the rounds as we are over in the UK struggling with this Brexit thing is a quote from Anira Bevan, who said something like, sovereignty is a notion which history is rapidly emptying of meaning.
Maybe you need to tell them who Anira Bevan was. These are Americans.
Sorry?
These are Americans. You need to say who he was.
Oh, right, yes, sorry. Anira Bevan was the architect of the National Health Service, who was a very big figure in the Labour government that came in after World War II. And it's interesting to consider that at that point, people were rethinking the notion of sovereignty and asking what it meant. I guess with the sort of knowledge that if part of Europe goes down the pan, politically, socially, or whatever, then it's going to have an impact on everybody else. So I guess perhaps it was that part of that context. But when you think about the global Earth system, and you think about the international economy, and this is one of the things that we're really struggling with in the Brexit thing, people don't actually understand the extent to which the economy is now so tightly coupled across the world. We have a very different notion of what sovereignty might mean. And I think, anyway, we're talking about justice today, not about sovereignty, but we do have, when we're talking about justice, we always have to think about where are we drawing the boundaries around our system. And just to go back to Europe again, I mean, we are still, and many European countries are trying to draw their boundaries very much around Europe and keep out other influences. And, you know, again, some people would say that this is denying historic and systemic responsibilities for situations that we've contributed to. Anyway, so, yeah. I think that's probably enough about, well, the complex. Okay, so let's think about practice. One of the things that we try and do in the Schumacher Institute is contribute to the capacity of the sustainability movement to succeed in contributing to participatory governance for sustainable futures. I guess there's an assumption there that more participatory governance will be more just. Again, where do we put the boundaries around our governance systems? And the need for complex knowledge, and how do we spread the sort of knowledge and skills of how to ways to use and respond to complexity more widely. And you know, I do genuinely think that to understand issues of justice in this complex and interdependent world, you do need to understand some of these more complex sort of nexi, I'm not sure if that's right, of interactions. Otherwise, you know, it's quite plausible for people to sort of think, well, you know, my priority is justice at home in my small circle, and perhaps in my country, and sort of that's it. But I suppose I would argue that when you understand complexity and interdependence, issues of justice and issues of sort of enlightened self-interest begin to merge a lot more fully. An interesting example of this, which I used in the book I wrote about philosophy and sustainability, is the idea that governments want, let's talk about climate change. Climate change is primarily, climate science has been primarily at the global level. But governments are now increasingly still funding more detailed attempts at describing what it will mean for their country or their region. And one of the ethics students argued that this is because governments still think that they can game it. They think they can sort of work out, you know, is climate change going to be too bad for us? How much can we really justify of putting in of the gross national product, you know, into climate mitigation and adaptation? What's the sort of optimal way that we can come out of this as a country without really understanding that you know, the facts are like, if Africa fries, if Australia fries, then the whole global environment is going to be totally compromised. It really is a we are all in the same boat situation. We can't do that gaming things anymore, and I think this is something that people find very difficult to get their heads around, actually, because we're so used to, in, you know, international negotiations, of thinking about how we can get the advantage. that's another. I know I'm raising loads of questions here. Yes, well, normative political philosophy, I think, has got an awful lot to offer, but I do think it has to be informed now by understanding the complexity of the Earth system. And I guess that's what the Converge project was all about. And the idea of convergence as a principle, the idea being that we should seek to, rich countries should seek to reduce their use of energy, resources and the atmosphere, whilst understanding and supporting poorer countries in often increasing their use, and moving to efficient technologies. And that we should converge at some kind of sustainable level is a sort of broad, ethically informed vision of global development that is roughly consistent with some of the mess that we're in. We don't know what a sustainable level is even now. We have a lot better idea than we did. So just to move on very briefly from that to look at another and related topic which has to do with global justice, and this is just me plugging my book, which has got more discussion of some of the themes that we've been talking about. Just to go on to, I'm sorry. I'll leave it there for the moment. What I'm actually going to address is the sort of coloured 4-pager that you've been sent around about restorative land use, which is a document that we put together for Paris 2015. It is still very relevant, I would argue. And it talks about justice and land use and climate. And I guess probably the best diagram would be a stabilisation wedges diagram on there. So basically the argument here is that half of all global emissions are caused by land use, at least. Although, you know, all sorts of different estimates are put forward by different agencies and groups. But there is absolutely no doubt that land use, farming, forestry, etc., are a massive issue. Not just the biotic feedbacks from forests and so on, but agri-biz generates enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. And we are all beginning to know a bit more about this and understand issues to do with diet. I think what really bugged me, and one of the motivations for doing this, is that when people are talking about policy options, hardly anyone looks at the enormous potential there is for restoration and regeneration of the planet, which is something that we could be investing in. This is a real policy option. And, you know, the information and the expertise is there, and this is a matter of political will and arguably a great matter of global justice. So if you thought about, look at the economy of the Earth as a whole, and I'll be finishing here in a minute. The economy of the Earth as a whole over the past 18 centuries, and what's been extracted in the form of wealth, and the price that's being paid for that extraction, and what should be done with that wealth in order to ensure that future generations and current generations have a future. We should be spending a lot of that money, that wealth that's been generated, on healing what's been destroyed and damaged in the process. And one of the things that is a real message of hope, it's a good place to stop, is the enormous potential for restoration. I mean, the early environmental movement was very, and still can be, very gloomy about the degree of destruction that goes on, and there is a genuine tragedy in the sense of loss. We will not recover some of the things that we have damaged, but the Earth has a huge capacity for regeneration, and a lot of systems can rebound if they're left alone or they're encouraged in the right way, can rebound to much richer ecosystems than was first thought. Of course, they vary, and ecosystems vary greatly in the extent to which they can recover and regenerate. But it was calculated, it has been calculated, and this is a pretty old number, so it's probably changed since then. But, the easy to restore sites on the Earth, but can also help restore people's livelihoods, could contribute about 2 degrees, mitigate global warming by about 2 degrees. I haven't talked that much about all the different systems, tools and approaches, but I hope I've kind of begun to demonstrate that a systems understanding is a really essential way, I would say, to begin to think about issues of global justice. So thank you very much for your attention. I will now go to that.
Thank you very much, Jen. That was a really great talk.